it is indeed critical for Africa to reflect on the past colonialism and transatlantic slave trade for several reasons, especially the fact that it shaped contemporary policies and development agenda in Africa. So one of the things that we look at is understanding historical context. And when we talk about understanding historical context, we're acknowledging the impact of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade, which help to contextualize the current socioeconomic and political realities that many African nations are confronted with. And in view of that, this gives us an opportunity for Africa to be able to devise the necessary policies that will address these socioeconomic and political challenges that are rooted in terms of exploitive colonial activities of the past. The second aspect that we want to look into is restorative justice. And when we talk about restorative justice, we are looking at the acknowledgement of the wrong that was perpetrated to Africans, which provide the basis for healing and reconciliation, but more fundamentally, also help in terms of fostering unity within and between member states, and more looking at the aspect of empowerment of marginalized communities. And then lastly, we'll want to look at the empowerment of economic development, I would say. And when you look at many African nations today are struggling economically as a result of the repercussion of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. So understanding the context help African policymakers to devise strategies and policies that will address the socioeconomic realities, especially strategies that gear towards sustainable economic management and empowerment of marginalized communities. In the first place, it is important to know that ECOSOCC is a policy interface organ. It's an advisory organ of the African Union that has mandates to provide input into the policies and programs of the African Union. So ECOSOCC, in terms of its programmatic intervention, is much more comprehensive in nature in terms of engagement. So looking at issues related to reparatory justice is very critical for ECOSOCC to be able to provide policy advice that is driven and owned by citizens. And to give meaning to that, the current theme of the year, ECOSOCC is presently having a consultation which has been running for the last 4 weeks. And the essence of this consultation is for civil society organizations to be able to provide policy recommendations to the African Union, to regional economic communities, to member states, and various bodies on how we can factor in terms of actions that needs to be taken in addressing issues related to reparatory justice, especially developing what we'll refer to as the African Common Position, and then also looking at issues related to restitution of stolen artifacts, acknowledgement of wrongs that has been done to African, and many other aspects that fall within the roadmap of the theme of the year. In terms of legacy, it actually shaped the landscape and our policy system in diverse ways. When you look at the institutional frameworks that are established during the colonial era, they were more exploitive. These, especially in the extractive industries, the system was built in such a way that Africa was made to be a continent that exports. So the system was not developed in terms of building institutional and technical capacity of the African citizens to be able to translate their raw materials into wealth. And therefore, Africa has remained an exporting continent, which also makes us extremely vulnerable in terms of our engagement in the global market. So that is one. The second is the land tenure system. The land tenure system across many African countries has been a major challenge also, which is also as a result of the colonial era policies which we inherited. And that is the reason why many African countries today are in the spirit of reform and also amending their constitution to ensure that we're able to have equity, parity, and proportionate distribution of wealth and resources. And lastly is the whole aspect of the categorization of the social status of society, where you look at the strata of society, where you have huge disparity between what you refer to as the haves and the have-not. And therefore, we did not have a system which provide an economic equilibrium in a scenario where you will say resources are equitably distributed across the board. Therefore, Africa continent, especially women, the youth, are then disadvantaged in many ways. So these are areas which has really affected the landscape and our policies in diverse ways. Yeah, 2025 has been considered by the African Union as the year for reparatory justice. It is very critical for the African Union Economic, Social, and Cultural Council, considering the fact that we work with civil society and diaspora constituent. And therefore, when we talk about reparation, it has to do with the citizens of this continent and those that have African, from the African and diaspora. Therefore, ECOSOCC as an organ of the African Union is one of the key implementing body to ensure that we practically implement the roadmap of this year theme. And some of the key things that we are looking at is first to send a strong message that when we talk about reparation, we are not talking about compensation only. Acknowledgement of the past wrongs that were committed to Africa is very critical. In fact, it is also important to know that acknowledgement is the first step to self-repair. We need first to repair. We also want to look at the aspect of healing and reconciliation and the whole idea of fostering unity amongst especially communities that were marginalized and communities that were affected during the transatlantic slave trade. The second aspect is for the African Union to develop what they call the African Common Position on reparatory justice, healing and reconciliation. We want to have a blueprint, a policy framework that guides the engagement on this particular global movement that the African Union, through the theme for 2025, has put in place. Another aspect which is also very critical is the aspect of restitution of stolen artifacts. And I think there has been a whole lot of campaign by many civil society organizations that African artifacts are lying in museums in the West. And therefore, there is a whole lot of advocacy around the restitution of stolen artifacts. But beyond that, we want to develop, like I said, or mobilize African civil society voices to ensure that we have a much more global movement that will advocate on the whole aspect of reparation. So reparation is more holistic, reparation is comprehensive, reparation is not only looking at compensation, reparation is looking at many aspects, even contemporary issues that our continent is confronted with, issues such as the climate justice, the debt burden that is affecting Africa, and looking at reform within the Security Council. These are all critical issues that affect our contemporary society, but they are emanating from the exploitative engagement during colonial era and during the transatlantic slave trade. And therefore, Africans through ECOSOCC want to come together to have a unified voice and to demand for reparation in the strongest possible way